Welcome to the Insider's Guide to Real Estate. My name is Victor Normand and I'll be your host. Today our topic is the real estate appraisal. And my guest today is Lora. Welcome, Pam.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming by. So you're a real estate appraiser, and real estate appraisers are used in every real estate transaction that involves a loan. But consumers may or may not even be aware that there's a real estate appraiser in the mix. Everything goes well, the appraisal comes in at the right value, the deal goes through, they buy the house. But it has always been an important component of the home buying process. So you've been in the business for a while now. Why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and how you ended up becoming a real estate appraiser?
I have been an appraiser for probably about 11, 12 years now. I started out working for a large bank, and we used appraisers, and things got a little bit long hours, hectic, work hours at the bank. So my appraiser took me aside because it was one of my favorite things that we used to do at the bank, is we would actually go to people's houses and kind of determine a so-called value on the house. And I started training and got my license about 10, 12 years ago. And I've been doing it ever since, and it's been great.
Okay.
Nice and
so briefly, what exactly constitutes a real estate appraisal?
A real estate appraisal is the market value in a house, how much it's really worth. It's based on other sales in the neighborhood or in the town. And it's something that we do for not only purchases, but also refinances and equity loans and such. And
it's a number that, even on the same piece of property, changes over time.
It does. It can change from season to season. We're based on information maybe that has happened in the last 3 to 6 months. So something that might sell in the winter might sell a little bit for a little bit less than might sell in the summertime. So it can fluctuate. Not a lot, depending on the market, if it's a stable market, but it can fluctuate a little bit. Okay,
so basically it's there's comparables that you look at, and then applying your judgment and experience to gauge the effect of these seasonal or economic external conditions that affect value.
Yeah, there's that. There's different upgrades in homes and the location. There's a lot that goes into it. It's all gridded out, and it's all based on market information.
Okay. So 2008 is kind of a watershed in recent real estate history. The recession occurred in 2008, the subprime crisis, and the way real estate as an industry functioned before 2008 has virtually all changed, not only in the appraisal function, lending, real estate sales, and marketing in general. So what was it like before the recession in doing a real estate appraisal with respect to how the process came about, who you would deal with? That sort of thing.
Typically before the market fell, we would have, either someone like yourself call me, or someone from the bank directly, and they would order the appraisal for us or say, hey, what do you think this will come in at? And it was just a formality, I think, more than anything. Banks would look at the bottom line on an appraisal and say, oh, it's worth $300, great, and they'd move on. After the market fell, everything got a little bit more serious. The write-ups were more intense. There's more comps added. It used to be, we had to include 3 comparable sales, and that went from 3 to 5. So that turned out to be a difference. We had 3 closed sales and 2 listings. So it was a little bit more involved. The write-ups, became 1 or 2 sentences to really paragraphs and paragraphs of why you chose certain comps and why you didn't choose certain comps. And the banks wanted to protect themselves. So.
So to some extent, there was, a lot of us were doing things that have changed, and to some extent, some of what we were doing was blamed for the subprime housing crisis. Well, let's just stop for a minute, and you have a lending history as well. What exactly is subprime?
Subprime would be sort of like the secondary market. Maybe, if you don't qualify under a bank's terms, we would ask you, let's say you had a glitch in your credit back a few years ago. A bank at that time might not have given you the loan. We would say, well, what happened in 2005, that you were late on your mortgage once or twice? And we'd go down and we'd get a story and we would log it out. But, we would charge more for the loan because it was more of a risk. You're not a perfect credit history. So instead of paying, I don't know what the rates were at the time, but instead of paying 5%, you might have paid 10%, that sort of thing. But you couldn't get a loan anywhere else. So that's kind of what subprime, their niche into the market was, the not so perfect customer.
Sub meaning lower,
Yeah.
just what it implies, and nothing inherently wrong with the subprime loan. They're still made. If again, it's that interest differential that induces a lender to make the loan.
Yeah.
The problem, of course, back then was there were too many of them. And then something happened in the marketplace that many of us, though we should have known better, didn't, and that is that real estate values don't always go up from year to year.
Yeah, forever and ever.
And they do come down and sometimes come down dramatically. So do you think in your experience or what you saw happening back then that it was known that we really were doing too many of these subprime loans, but everything seemed to be moving in the right direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think if everyone took a step back and thought about it, it's not going to happen forever. And I think a lot of the problem was that people bought their house for $150,000, and every year it would go up, $20,000, $30,000. So, they just got wrapped up into putting their bills into their mortgage, putting their car payment into their mortgage, and before they knew it, their mortgage was huge. They maybe couldn't afford the actual payment on it, or maybe they just could barely afford the actual payment. So when the market fell, all these people were left with, owing more than what the actual value was now. So
you're talking about refinancing a home, and that's the other ingredient that was happening, is that the mortgage would be in place, the subprime loan, but then there was an opportunity to refinance and take money out.
Yeah.
So how widespread was that back then?
That was a big chunk of what we did for our business. So, and you'd have the same customers come back year after year and looking for, slightly more money on their mortgage, and you could give it to them because the market was going up, everything was great, and
So the appraisal indicated
that
to the lender
it
that
was,
the value
and it was
there.
worth it at the time, because it's all based on what someone is willing to pay for their house. So that's what the market is who's going to pay what amount for this particular house, and that's what appraisals are based on.
Yeah, and then another ingredient to all this was the fact that many or all, I'm not sure to what extent, of these subprime loans were not fixed rate loans for an extended period of time. They were adjustable loans. So what happens in that circumstance?
So when that happens, if it was a 3-year adjustable loan, and 3 years that payment can skyrocket, and then they can't afford it, they're stuck, they can't refinance. In a lot of circumstances, people just ended up walking away from their homes, and that became a big problem.
That became an issue. Again, what gave people the incentive to do this, or rationalization to do that, was that even though I'm going to be faced with an adjustment in my rate that may increase my monthly payments, the value will still be there in the property.
Yeah. Because that's what was happening at the time. It just kept going up, the value.
So now 2008 comes along, and what really triggered what was happening on the day when Lehman Brothers failed, and everybody realized that the values weren't there? What was the trigger to that?
Well, I think everybody was looking to point fingers at somebody else. Who made this happen? And I think appraisers got a good chunk of that. The blame for all that. But I think it's a little piece from everyone that just kind of it happened. And there was some bad appraisers that would appraise it for more, and maybe the thinking was, well, it'll be worth that anyway in a few months, and they would try to squeak out a deal for a certain person, and they've actually since eliminated pretty much the appraiser speaking to someone at the bank. Because what would happen is, if you're my friend and you're looking for it to come in at $400,000, you're talking to me, can you make it happen? And the appraiser would bend over backwards to make it happen, and it didn't necessarily mean that it was worth $400,000. It might have only been worth $350,000. And then when the market fell, that person was in trouble. They owed more than it was worth. So
it sounded like there was more of an informal relationship going on between lenders and appraisers and real estate agents. And again, in the background was this sense that even if we made a little bit of a mistake, the market's going to add value to this,
it would correct
property.
itself eventually. And so since then, now banks have to sort of generically give out the appraisals. We can't talk to the bank about it. you know, the word value comes up, you can't talk about it to the, you know, real estate agent, to the consumer, to the bank, nothing. You know, it has to be anonymous kind of a give out. So
Hands off.
yeah, hands off
situation
to eliminate that end of it, which is probably a good thing.
So I think that really what did trigger it was that it wasn't a case of an individual loan or several loans within a bank. That almost all these loans were sold on the secondary market and packaged into bond offerings, and there weren't real estate appraisers who were evaluating these bond offerings. There were bond rating companies that did that, and I guess I've always been amazed that they didn't come under a greater criticism, because I mean, a real estate appraisal is looking at a narrow piece of property. The bond ratings are looking at a package of these, and I guess they had some very, very creative ways of taking that bond offering and making these subprime loans less apparent within that bond offering. But the day finally came, the market corrected all that and
Yeah,
said
and
that
we
that's
learned.
not
Yeah.
the case, and we learned. So again, prior to 2008, was it easier to become a real estate appraiser than
It was. They've changed a lot of the rules and requirements to becoming an appraiser. So there's always been a certain amount of classes in school that you have to take and a certain amount of hours you have to train. I believe at the time it was 2 years and like 2,000 hours, and now you have to have an associate's degree, the same time frame but more hours, more classes. And it's just more difficult to become an appraiser now. Not many banks will actually accept a trainee appraiser, and you need to be a trainee for at least 2 years to get your license. So it's difficult when many banks are still a little bit scared to accept a trainee appraiser, and so it kind of limits the amount of appraisers that are actually out there now.
But prior to 2008, trainee appraisers were...
Could just go out by yourself. Now, you know, if you're a trainee, you have to go with the person that's training you and do the actual appraisal. Whereas before, as a trainee myself, we'd go out to the houses all by ourselves, and good and bad, but you learn, and that's, you know, that's the experience that you have to gain, is to get the experience, and you should be with somebody to go out there, I think, you know, just not to make any mistakes.
Sure.
And catch all the...
Sure. So 2008, the values went down dramatically, and since then, in many communities, the values have come back up to their pre-recession levels. Not everywhere.
Yeah.
So in your work, what was there was a period of time, like right after 2008, when the market was really slow, and everyone was very cautious, and perhaps too cautious. How did that?
Well, it was
impact
difficult
you?
for a long time because the only houses that sold were either foreclosures or short sales. So how we base our values is what has sold recently. Now, in this type of market, I wouldn't typically use a foreclosure or a short sale because there's other sales, legitimate sales, that you could look at. However, when all you have is foreclosures and short sales, then you have to look at those as market value. So it was difficult for realtors, it was difficult for appraisers, it was difficult for banks, because it just kind of made everyone stop and not be able to do anything, you know.
So there's
for a while.
Significant number of foreclosures and
There was a significant number.
and short sales. You couldn't ignore them in the market.
You couldn't. There was just too many of them, and there wasn't many sales other than short sales or foreclosures at the time. So
Let's just talk. What is a short sale?
a short sale is when you owe, let's say, $300,000 on your house, and it's only worth $250,000. So the bank says, instead of foreclosing and going through the whole process of foreclosing, they'll take what the person owes on it and forgive the balance on it. Sometimes they'll, come back to them and have a payment arrangement for the balance, and sometimes they won't. But it kind of lets the homeowner out of their house, and the bank gets most of their money or some of their money, and the homeowner can leave and, not have to be upside down on their house.
So what's the role of the real estate appraiser in a short sale transaction?
Same sort of thing. We just give a legitimate market value to it, what it's worth. So the bank knows realistically what it's worth versus what they owe. So then they can make a determination on what the person could put the house on the market for and what they'll accept, as far as less than what they owe.
So at what point in the process does the appraisal take place?
That I don't really know. I think sometimes it can happen where the homeowner might try to refinance and they get the appraisal back, and the bank realizes that they're upside down, the homeowner realizes they're upside down, and then they negotiate that way. I've done it the other way around, where the bank was starting the foreclosure process and they were talking about possibly doing a short sale instead. So, you go out there and you give them the value that you think they could sell it for today, and then they'll go that route. But
So a bank could initiate a short sale?
I don't think they would. I think that would be more of the homeowner. Maybe they're in trouble at the time, they can't afford their monthly payment, or they're trying to refinance and they can't. So I think it would come more so from the homeowner to begin with.
Okay. Or they've stopped making payments.
Or they stop, yeah,
on
the
a house,
collection
and the bank
agent, yeah.
knows something's up. And the foreclosure process is not a efficient process.
It's
takes
not.
quite a
It
while.
takes a long time, and then you have an empty home that needs to sell, and in certain markets it just doesn't work out all that nice. And short sales is kind of like a win-win for both parties if someone can't afford their mortgage.
So if the foreclosure process is embedded within every mortgage, that the lender has the right to do that in the event that monthly payments are not made.
Yeah.
But short sale is never included in them, where it's not anything that the bank would lead with, but it represents an alternative to foreclosure. So from an appraiser's perspective, if a lender decides to just go through the foreclosure process, the borrower has stopped making payments, the bank has given them notice, they followed what is required under the mortgage agreement, they've actually foreclosed on the house, and now the bank owns the property. Would the bank have done an appraisal before they foreclosed?
Typically they would. I know I've done both. I've gone out there and appraised the property right at the foreclosure. It just takes so much time that sometimes they'll end up ordering another appraisal, because it can take a year or so with all the rules and regulations around foreclosing, that sometimes you'll go out and the house has been empty for a year or two. So, it just depends.
So it's possible that the bank forecloses, they have an appraisal done on the property. It looks like the value is at, or maybe could be more than the debt on the house. So they foreclose, they put the house on the market, the house sits there for any length of time. A buyer comes along, that must trigger an additional appraisal at that point.
Well, anytime that someone's going to purchase a house, that the bank that they're trying to get a mortgage for to buy the house will order another appraisal just to make sure that it's worth, what they're buying it for. So you would, yeah.
Run into a situation where you have conflicting appraisals, where the bank has one that places one value and the new buyer.
You could, yeah. I mean, you could have two different values on a house. Foreclosures can be difficult. Because at the time, and you're talking about probably two different time frames too, where I might go out and do an appraisal on a foreclosed property in December, and the time it sells it may be June, which could be two different market times, and so yeah, they could be slightly conflicting.
Is there any standard within the industry for how long an appraisal is good for?
I believe most banks have tightened it up. When I first started appraising and when I worked for a bank, usually they would say a year. If you had an appraisal within the past year, we could always use that, depending on the equity situation of the home, of course. And when I first started appraising too, we did a lot of drive-by appraisals, where we would just drive by someone's house for a refinance and give a value based on an assumption of what the house would look like on the inside. And typically those would happen because somebody had a good deal of equity. You don't see those anymore because they want you to go in and take pictures of every room and note everything.
So now we're in a different world.
Yeah.
As I mentioned early on, that a home buyer may not even be aware that an appraisal is taking place. So they may hear about it, but it doesn't really involve them necessarily. It involves the lender and the listing side of the transaction. Very concerned about an appraisal. What should consumers be aware of with respect to an appraisal, whether they're selling the house or buying the house? Let's start with someone who's selling the house. What should they be concerned about?
Well, I think it's really, at that point, it's kind of out of their hands. I think it's more important that As an appraiser, I meet with the realtor. It's always sometimes nice to meet with a homeowner because you can get the details of the house. They just really need to make sure. I think presentation is half of it, which is probably, when you're listing it, you go through that with them. But they just really, it's out of their hands at that point, and I'm just using market data in the neighborhood. So, unless they know something specifically about a home, maybe someone was divorcing or there was a problem and it sold for less, that kind of information, I don't need much from the homeowner besides what has been done to the house and roughly when, kitchen updates and bathroom updates.
But when you say the real estate agent, you mean mostly the listing agent who had a lot to do with putting the value on the house in the first place, perhaps spent a lot of time looking at comparable sales, and you come along and in a much shorter period of time are asked to do the same thing. So there's nothing wrong with the listing agent giving you the benefit of their analysis of what the price.
No, I don't think there's a problem with that. And actually, I think that's great because, like you said, we're there for a short period of time. Possibly we don't know the neighborhood as great as you might know it. If I'm having a problem or not understanding, or if it's a unique house, I will ask the realtor, how did you come up with this number? Like, how did you price it?
So from a consumer's perspective, they're selling their house. It wouldn't be wrong for them to be sure that their agent is there when the appraiser goes there.
They should. I would say the agent should be there.
Definitely
should be there, because you could miss something, and they're going to know there's a backup. There's a discussion that happens at the house that you need the agent there. It just helps out a little bit.
Okay, so even though the process has become more formalized and there are firewalls between lenders and appraisers, and you're really being asked to do a totally independent third-party evaluation of the property to come up with the value, having the information from the listing agent is a benefit and isn't in conflict. You're not obligated to use that information.
No, I think the information that you're going to provide as an agent to an appraiser would typically point out things that we might not see right away. When the roof was replaced, the kitchen was updated, new flooring was put in. Maybe something about the particular neighborhood that we might not notice. Maybe you could walk to a lake or to a town center, but they're not saying it's worth $300,000 because of these, and they're not supposed to shove comparables in your face, but they can point out the benefits of the house and help you understand that house, because every house is unique. So.
Sure. So they're providing that kind of information, and in terms of comparables, it's all public information that you have access directly to. So you may miss a house that recently sold in a neighborhood, or that nothing wrong with putting that in front of you. So now on the buy side, someone has made an offer on the house. They think the house is worth what they've offered, obviously. They go to get their mortgage. The lender calls you and says, do an appraisal. Your appraisal comes in, it's less than the sale price. What options does the buyer have at that point?
Well, they can renegotiate the purchase and sale. I believe in most purchase and sales, it'll say the appraisal has to come in at whatever the purchase price is, so they can back out if they wanted to. They could I've had people put more money down because they wanted it for a specific reason. Take, for instance, if this has happened a few times where someone's parents have lived in close proximity, maybe a neighbor, and they really wanted that house, so they opted to pay more for it. It doesn't mean that it's worth more. It just means they're willing to pay more because of their personal preference to live near their parents. But as an appraiser, you go in there, you're going to tell them what it's really worth to everyone else, and then they may be willing to put the extra $10,000 or whatever they offered over the purchase price. So that happens sometimes.
Are there any circumstances where you may be asked to review your appraisal?
I have on occasion. Sometimes, the homeowner will come back with comps on a refinance and say, well, what about this one and this one? The problem with us not talking value with customers nowadays is most people have a good understanding that you can go on these websites and figure out a general value for your house, but sometimes people aren't aware that if it's an antique house, you wouldn't compare that to a brand new construction house. And, if you're on a busy road, I'm looking for comps on busy roads. So there's got to be some sort of understanding, and sometimes there's just like a gap in what we use versus what you think we should use.
And then you could have a situation where a seller thinks that the backyard swimming pool, in-ground swimming pool is a great value to the house,
Yeah.
and the buyer thinks so as well, but
The
in
market might not
marketplace,
indicate that, yeah.
that houses with swimming pools are not more or less valuable than houses without them.
Yeah.
So,
That happens.
so now you've been doing this for some time. I'm sure you've run across some unusual situations and that you're faced with. What can you tell us?
Everything is unusual, I think, nowadays. I've been in some homes where, like a hoarder, you might have that. I've been in some really neat homes where I used to do a lot more in Boston, and I got opportunities to go up to, the top level rooftop decks, beautiful views. Typically, I do suburbia now where, you have your 3-bedroom cape, nothing too strange. It depends on the day and what I guess you consider odd, because I think when I first started out, I thought everything was a little strange, and now, you kind of adapt to, and you probably see
Sure,
it too
I
in your
mean,
line of work when, you're surprised that, they didn't clean up, or, maybe the horse lives half in the house, or just some strange sort of,
So how does that affect value if you walk into a house and it's chock full of magazines from...
I just note it. I think anything, smoking in a house, anything like that, you just have to put it in there. And the value, you don't know. I've had it happen the other way around too, where some of the comps that I've used might have, been smoke filled or cats or, something that just, it might have a certain smell or odor to it. But you just do the best you can, and you just, you can't know everything about every house, but you try to, that's why it's important to talk to realtors, and it's important to talk to the homeowner if they knew why something might have sold for less in the neighborhood. So.
Okay. So sometimes you could have a situation where you go into a house and you observe things that are beyond your field of expertise, a structural problem, the floor is sagging or something of that sort. So in that case, how would you handle that?
I would just tell the bank. I would just tell them that it appears that there is a structural issue, and I don't specialize in that, so I would tell them they should get someone in there to do it, and then it's out of my hands at that point, so they would have to, find someone to figure that out.
Okay, and work that out between the buyer and seller and
And
the
then
lender.
typically I would say, if it's okay, if there is no structural issues, you would make it, pending that there is no structural issues, it is still worth $300,000 or whatever the value is on the house. But then they would come back with you with some sort of a certificate, or, so you can check off that now it is worth
Right, so in
that.
some cases, the value is set subject to correcting whatever the defect is that you noted. So just to end up with, any words of wisdom in general with respect, other than being kind to your real estate appraiser when they come by?
Yeah, I think being kind is nice. I would just give the advice of point out the good stuff, not necessarily the bad stuff. I've had people, come in and tell me everything that's wrong with their house. But, just tell me what you've put into it. We used to have a thing when I worked for a bank, and we would determine whether or not someone had a lot of, I'm trying to think what we'd call it. They put a lot into their house. Their heart and soul was in their house. And so you like to see that. If someone has pride in their house and they've put a lot into it, whether it's planting a garden or fixing a floor or painting a room, just let us know everything. I can determine later whether or not it adds value, but it's just nice
So
to...
there's a certain science to it, but then there's also this personal, subjective piece that shouldn't be ignored.
Yes, exactly.
Well, thanks very much for being on our show. That's it for today. Thanks for watching.